everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and I am Yves Engler, coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. I hope everyone's doing well. Here it's very, very hot. You might see me sweating. We don't have any air conditioning. There's been lots of developments in Canadian foreign policy. So I'll get right to it. Earlier today, I did an interview with Joe Emmesberger on the upcoming elections in Venezuela. And that's I think a kind of an interesting, you can see that on my YouTube channel. Where those go to elections and the whole kind of failure of Trudeau's foreign policy. What was Trudeau government's biggest foreign policy failure, I would say, really in 2019, 2020 was the big push to oust Maduro, and now we have elections. Obviously, if Maduro wins these elections, it would be a pretty big confirmation of the failure of Trudeau's foreign policy. Anyways, in the interview, Joe goes over some of the, what the big, who the different candidates are, the main candidate, and some of the background of efforts to sanction Venezuela's economy and a kind of recap of the really intense campaign in recent years, but also really over 20 years to overthrow the Bolivarian project, which Canada has been right at the center of. The New York Times had this piece with the Kenyan police in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and the image they showed of this Kenyan police, and there's been a number of stories about how they haven't really done anything in the first few weeks they've been there. And they have an image of, like, I don't know, it is 6 or 8 Kenyan police in Port-au-Prince in front of the U.S. Embassy, kind of like protecting the U.S. Embassy, which is kind of like, to me, it's remarkable. They don't even like kind of hide what they're doing, right? They're claimed to be there to help like poor people who are being terrorized by gangs, but what they really are concerned about is protecting the U.S. Embassy. The optics of it are terrible. Today in Rwanda, there's elections, and apparently, according to the thing I saw on Twitter, the Kagame is saying he got 99.15% of the vote, which is a little bit more than his last election. Someone was joking about how he's in a bit of a bind though, because for the next election, the margin he can go up is getting tighter and tighter, right? At 99.15, you don't got much room there to keep getting better every election. So he's going to be running out of real estate there in terms of confirming his increasing popularity as these 30 years of dictatorial rule continue. Judy Rever has quite a good piece in Canadian Dimension a few days ago titled "Canada's Whitewashing of Africa's Most Ruthless Regime," where she kind of goes over Canada's support for Kagame. She talks about one of the additions that I didn't know about. She talks about how Toronto Raptors president Masai Ujiri, who's really close with Kagame, and Romeo Dallaire, that they are invested through this urban development project in Kigali through investment fund Helios Fairfax. So they apparently have some like money invested in this project, which of course would be tied into Kagame's rule and their relationship to Kagame. I'm inferring here, but I would be very surprised if it wasn't correct. But it kind of goes through some of Canada's support for Kagame, which is very few people that have documented this, and it's a genuine scandal. Today on Al Jazeera, on the news a couple hours ago, I was watching, there was a protest in Congo, I think it was in Goma, against the M23, which apparently has captured some more towns, the Rwandan sponsored not just a proxy for it, but really Rwandan forces that are right at the center of the M23 and their invasion, which has displaced around 2 million people. It's almost 2 million people have been displaced in Eastern Congo. So it's a really, it's a significant humanitarian issue. And Canada's backing Kagame. Anyways, this story from Reddit Rever is worth checking out in Canadian Dimension, which just kind of brings together a lot of what we know about Canada's support for this ruthless dictator within Rwanda, but also this constant violence in Eastern Congo. Jacobin has a piece titled "Canada is Arming the World's Bullies," which goes over Canada's arms exports last year from friend over at Project Plowshares and Casey, sorry, Gallagher. Yeah, anyways, he publishes it, kind of goes over the data about, I forget the exact numbers, a few $billion Canadian arms exports, obviously big increase to Israel, continued major sales to Saudi Arabia, UAE. Also, again, points out, which we know, but it's really important to remind ourselves that most Canadian arms exports are not even tabulated, because most Canadian arms exports go to the US, and we don't even know the dollar figure, because it's treated as if Canada's companies are treated as if they're just part of the US defense industrial base, and as if it's not even an export. And of course, US weapon systems go all around the world. And so Canada has major arms exports in that way. At the NATO summit, and really, honestly, this is a seriously depressing development, with the Trudeau government conceding to this pressure from NATO, from the US, from the dominant media in this country, of announcing they're going to go to the 2% of GDP, which is of military spending, which is an absolutely, completely arbitrary number. It's just literally plucked from the sky. Now, obviously, right away, you already have the commentators saying, well, 2% is a floor, and the ceiling should be more, right? And so we're going to get right away, once the 2% is, in earshot, it's going to be, well, we got to go 2.5, we got to go to 3. And there's already other NATO countries are saying that. This is scandalous, beyond scandalous, when we have like increased heat waves in the West, devastation in the Caribbean with Beryl, stuff in Houston. We're seeing the climate crisis is a genuine security threat, and we're seeing more and more and more evidence of that. Also, when I walk around here, I'm really noticing in this summer, the number of unhoused people is growing. It's growing and growing and growing. We have real security threats on the climate front. We have real social needs in terms of building public housing. And we're going to pump a huge amount more into the military. It's just absolutely, totally scandalous. I don't actually believe Trudeau's going to get to the 2%, because I think it's so obviously not a social need that Canada has, and ultimately, as much as they whip up the drumbeats of war, the public basically understands that we're not actually under any military threat from anywhere. The only country that can realistically invade Canada is the country demanding we spend more on our military, which is the US, which obviously, if they thought the Canadian military was going to defend against their invasion, they wouldn't be calling for increased Canadian military spending. They understand full well that every contribution that Canada makes to the military is serving the US empire in terms of Canadian forces being aligned with it, and in terms of the companies producing the weapons. Now, they, of course, hype up the jobs that will come from increased investments in military spending. But military spending, or specifically arms spending, is not a jobs creator. It's very poor in terms of job creation. Spending on education, health sector, education specifically, much more, creates many more jobs. The military spending, arms purchases at least, spending on the actual military and having more men or women in the force, that actually does create jobs. But arms spending is a very high tech thing, a capital intensive endeavor that creates very little jobs versus, again, spending on more teachers or the educational sector or even the healthcare sector. I think it's usually considered around 4-to-1 in education spending of job creation versus arms spending. So the business about this being good for job creation and certainly building social housing would create more jobs. So that's, I think, a point that needs to be kind of mentioned. In that, there's this new agreement that Canada, Finland, and the US to build these icebreakers that was announced a few days ago, which apparently is a big sop to the Canadian icebreaking company, which I believe is is it Irving, or is it the one out in is it, no, I think it's Davie. I think it's the Davie shipyard in Quebec City area. But they apparently, I think I saw that they are they also may own the ship the icebreaker facility in Finland. I think maybe I saw that. Anyways, there's an announcement there. It's not exactly clear what this is going to mean, but it's this Canada, Finland, US project to build more vessels. At the NATO summit, the Trudeau government announced 500 million in assistance, more military assistance to Ukraine, as well as 389 million, up to 389, for F-16 pilot training through this the pilot training facility that the NATO has set up for Ukrainian pilots. I don't know. It's a good chance that CAE, which is the Canadian Montreal-based company that's top-end pilot training, they're probably going to get some of that money. So another big, contribution to the NATO proxy war was announced by the Trudeau government at the summit a couple of days ago. There was a protest. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress crowd organized a demo in Toronto, which I saw something online for, close the skies over Ukraine, which is, again, I think, putting back to the whole no-fly zone, which would really bring bombing or shooting down Russian aircraft, which would just go one step further. So that's I think a very mistaken idea and mistaken direction of going further and further down this warfare path. The Globe and Mail published a lead editorial. I'm not sure it was on Saturday or Friday. It was warning may contain traces of the Kremlin disinformation. And it quotes from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Disinfo Watch, which of course was set up, Marcus Kolga. Disinfo Watch was set up with funding from the US government. And in this thing, they talk about they talk about RT and Sputnik and Russian propaganda on Twitter and social media and the like. Where whatever, right? It's not a new beat and it's not untrue. There's truths in there for sure. But in this editorial, they also refer to what they describe as regime-aligned influencers on social media platforms. Canadian audiences are exposed to content posted by influencers in Canada, the US, and beyond. And then they refer to those people as useful idiots aligned to the Kremlin. That, of course, Kolga, I guarantee that refers to me. I'm among the useful idiots of the Globe Mail, or what Kolga would refer to as regime-aligned influencers. He's made that clear quite a few times in the past. And it's more of this constant, Canadians are being impacted by the Russian narrative, and too many Canadians. I think I talked about this, the study coming out last week or maybe the week before, and this is the Globe Mail editorial picking up on it. It was referenced in a number of places this week, media outlets, again, Russia does have a propaganda system. There's no doubt about that. But there's also no doubt there's a lot of truth to the idea that the war was provoked, and that this isn't just the all saintly NATO and the all devilish Putin. This is a much more complicated conflict. and anyone who believes that it's more complicated is a regime-aligned influencer or a useful idiot. Now, at the NATO summit, they really kind of honed in on China. The final declaration has 14 different mentions of China or of the PRC. One of those says the PRC continues to pose systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security. So they really hype up the China thing. At the summit, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia were invited. They met with Secretary General of NATO. There was 4 different arrangements or accords that were instigated between NATO and those 4 countries. Those 4 countries, of course, are very far from the North Atlantic region. I think maybe Australia would be as far geographically as pretty much possible from the North Atlantic region, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody may know better about the world geography than me, but China, of course, is not in the North Atlantic region. It's quite a ways away from Europe. But NATO is really, over the past couple of years, has really picked up the China threat dynamic. And that, of course, is because NATO is not a defensive arrangement and not a North Atlantic only arrangement. It is a tool of US global domination. And the US empire increasingly sees China as a peer competitor, a possible challenge to its global hegemony, and is doing what it can to try to target China, to blunt China's rise. And it's now turning NATO in that direction. And those countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia specifically are, anchors of US military strategy in the region to try to contain China. And NATO is, coordinating on that front. There was also an announcement with Canada was part of this about Chinese hacking. US allies issue rare warning on China hacking group that came out on Tuesday or Wednesday, right at the start of the NATO summit. And it was the Five Eyes, Japan, South Korea, and I think there was a third country that basically claiming that China's this big threat in social media and hacking and this and that. I took it as really trying, it was all the media, all the, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, whole across the board media thing. So I take that as being really very much the official communique pushing of the Five Eyes amidst the NATO summit to sort of hype up this sort of China threat dynamic. So I think that there's the NATO stuff on China, and I want to go around to this history. I'm doing a piece on this with China. So NATO's never been a defensive arrangement. It's never been just about North Atlantic, and it's always had China in part in its crosshairs. And the Lester Pearson, when he was involved in creation NATO in 1949, he talked about NATO as basically this tool of global domination, about the Southeast Asia, about the Pacific region and NATO protecting that. And when Canada sent troops to Korea in the early 1950s, Pearson, as alongside some US officials, argued, at least privately, that we needed to do that in the context of NATO. That even though that Korea is very far from the North Atlantic region, that this was justified, and NATO justified dispatching troops to Korea. And of course, the Korean War was partly a war against China after the communist, what was really a communist/nationalist revolution of 1949. And then, of course, ultimately, when US-led forces in Korea bomb the electricity of China in North Korea and then approach Chinese border, China actually intervenes, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops fight US and Canadian and other forces in Korea. So this is that NATO's never been a defensive arrangement. I think that point needs to be highlighted repeatedly. Even people again on the left, I think I may have mentioned this last week, but even some people on the left are sort of critics of NATO, kind of frame it as if initially it was set up to counter the Soviet Union and this and that. That wasn't the case. I mean, there was an element in that, but it was not in a defensive sense. It was as a tool of global domination, of subordinating of reinforcing the decolonizing world, reinforcing colonialism, but subordinating that under the U.S.-led geopolitical umbrella. That's really what NATO was about. And you can look at the comments of Pearson. You can look at the Korean War as evidence of that, and of course, the bombing of Libya, war in Afghanistan, and stuff like that. Reaffirm that in recent decades, but it's always been the case. There was some parliamentary committee where Tristan Parsi, Iranian American prominent commentator, was removed after a backlash, and that MPP in Ontario, of Iranian monarchist Iranian who got kicked out of the caucus, Jamani, I'm forgetting her name right now, kicked out of Doug Ford's caucus recently. Thomas Juneau, establishment Trudeau foreign policy advisor type, the University of Ottawa professor, Goldie Gamari, somebody pointed, yeah, she then said that when Thomas Juneau said this was a mistake to block Tristan Parsi from to remove him from testifying before this parliamentary committee, then she basically said that how dare this I guess, I don't know if Juneau still has an official position, but had an official position, and how dare this guy who advocates for the Islamic regime, Juneau, that he's gone to public payroll and he should be ousted from University of Ottawa. She even kind of hints at that, which speaks to this sort of like McCarthyite sentiment around Iran. And I published a piece that Canada Files published today that goes into some of this background of how little reaction there's been to Canada listing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or part of the Iranian military, as a terrorist organization. There's basically no criticism, even though it very much it strengthens Israel's position while it's waging a Holocaust in Gaza, and the level of demonization of Iran. And there's nobody in the official politics or media really that will push back on this stuff. Is pretty stark. On the note of the horrors in Gaza, the UN is reporting that clearing Gaza of the 40 million tons of war rubble will take, they're estimating, about 15 years. There's obviously a horrible massacre, al-Masrari refugee camp, 48 hours ago, 72 hours ago now. A couple more, another one last 24 hours, reports another, I think it was another 80 people killed in Gaza. It's this last week has been, it seems, back to some of the worst weeks, 4, 5, 6 months ago. It's just kind of beyond belief. I think that Netanyahu is clear that he doesn't want negotiations of any sort, and that was the point of this terrible massacre that killed at least 90 and injured 300. And just, I don't know if people seen the images of the clouds after Israel dropped the bombs. It's just right out of I don't know, the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima or whatever, kind of looking. It's stunning, the horrors that continue. The National Post had a front page piece titled "Gaza Bubbles Plan Pitched to MPs. Aid would go to Hamas-free enclaves." And so Israel has apparently been floating this idea of like sort of having these Hamas-free areas of Gaza that they'll like kind of like collaborators with Israel they'll I guess provide food and materials, and they'll sort of, Israel will kind of let them operate and give them some perks as part of the sort of collaboration process with Israel is maybe it'll start like with one bubble, and if that's successful, then move to more bubbles, and the idea would be eventually Hamas would be sort of like eliminated from Gaza. Hamas has already said, they're saying they're as part of their negotiation position. The New York Times has this big piece about this, about how they're basically they're willing to concede the civil administration, right? They'll like let other forces operate civil administration as part of negotiations. They obviously won't disband their resistance, armed resistance, which Israel's asking for. And as the Hamas official pointed out, I think it was a New York Times piece, why, if Israel can't destroy us in 10 months, why would we just, voluntarily disband? I mean, that would be ridiculous. What was, right? So that's obviously not, that's a non-starter from a Hamas's perspective, but they're willing to at least throw out the notion as part of negotiations to have civil administration. But these bubble-free zones, I mean, this is just like, I think mostly a fanciful Israeli idea. And you have these like Canadian MPs that are being kind of like briefed on this as part of, I guess, Canada being kind of like brought in to this process, which is, it's, to me, this is just speaks to how stunningly colonial everything about this is. Like, what in the world do these Canadian MPs, like, what do they have to do with this, and us buying into this and them buying into it? But this is kind of like how colonial everything is with Palestinians. The Melanie Joly at the NATO summit, I believe, pretty sure, she met with her Israeli counterpart, Katz. So still, after 10 months of these horrors, they're still, meeting with Israeli officials, and not really, there's no condemnation there. Nora Loretta pointed out that after a few days after Lancet had published their article saying that a realistic estimate would be 186,000 excess deaths in Gaza from these Israel's horrors, that no Canadian media had reported on it. And I have not seen, the only Canadian media I've seen is the Montreal Gazette, in their story about McGill, which I'll get to in a little bit. They mention that they don't mention numbers. Interesting. There's just kind of a sentence or two that mentions that that some estimates would say, or the British Medical Journal say there'd be many more excess deaths. They don't mention the 186,000 number, but they point out that it's likely higher than the number that's being talked about of 38,000. The Maple published a interesting piece, an area that I have nothing to do with, but it makes total sense to me. It's falsehoods about Palestine go unchecked on talk radio. So I don't listen to talk radio, but they're basically pointing out that talk radio, particularly in Toronto, is just like horrible. It's even like worse than some of maybe the print media, in terms of it's just like deep bias against Palestinians, and just like lies that are being like spouted and never corrected. Anyways, it goes through some of that, which is interesting. The National Post on Saturday, just to give how insane the media sphere, they published front page. It's all about, I think it's I don't think this was, I'm not sure if this was on the title on the front page or on the inside page, but Doctors with Borders in Gaza. And then basically it's a whole complaint, 2-page spread on page, I believe it's page 2 and 3, front page, and then page 2 and 3 is all about how Médecins Sans Frontières has picked a side in Gaza, and it's like long piece, and how they didn't condemn Hamas on October 7th and this and that. And it ends off with this guy who they say is a former Secretary General, goes back to like the 1970s, apparently he broke away, and I think he created Médecins du Monde or something like that. And he says Rawson, a former Secretary General, remains pessimistic that Médecins Sans Frontières can take a more balanced approach to Israel and Gaza moving forward. And this is how the article ends. It cannot be fixed, he said, exasperated. How can you fix anti-Semitism, which is not an opinion, but a mental disease? So Médecins Sans Frontières is, like they're just this biased anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, whatever organization because they have that mental disease of anti-Semitism. And that's our media. 10 months later, all the numbers, whatever the reports from Lancet, whatever horrors, it's just all anti-Semitism. That's how it's framed. The Montreal Gazette reported on a new Quebec initiative. Resource targets anti-Jewish hatred. It's called Unlearn It. It's a new tool that the Quebec government and pro-Israel Jewish organizations have set up to educate children about anti-Semitism in Quebec schools. And this is, there's an endless stream of these projects across the country. And the more Israel kills, the more people in Canada oppose Israel killing Palestinian babies, the more initiatives about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about that appear, and they ramp it up and ramp it up and ramp it up. And that's the dynamic the Quebec government is willing to join in on. In Fredericton, they canceled the Pride Festival, partly after they had given the leading what they call it exactly to a Palestine solidarity group. And then the Zionists came down on Fredericton's Pride Festival, which is like probably a fairly small operation, it's all volunteer. And apparently there was even people who started like creating false accounts of board members of Pride, and then like I guess probably saying like anti-Semitic things online, claiming they were actually on the board, and it was just like creating false accounts. And so they're just basically smearing and making life horrible for everyone who's associated with it. And in that, one of the things that the National Post got, one of the successes they got, is that they got the New Brunswick's gay vice regal to sit out Pride Parade. So the vice regal, which is whatever that formal position with the provincial government, they then put out a statement to the National Post about them not participating in the Pride Parade, and it said, to uphold her commitment to neutrality and nonpartisanship, the Lieutenant Governor will not be marching in this year's Fierté Fredericton Pride Parade. While Her Honor firmly opposes the oppression of all marginalized groups, including Palestinian and Jewish people, she values inclusion and supports the guiding principles that pride is for everyone. The statement reads, the National Post. Now, and then that was a step towards the canceling the parade. Now, I want to stop on this, and I got to repeat this thing. And unfortunately, there's very few people willing to do this, but we have to do it because it's all over. Jewish community is not an oppressed group. No matter what the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick says, Jewish population in Canada is overrepresented among board of governors, corporate board of governors, among billionaire, among people with university degrees, et cetera, et cetera. It's not, the Jewish community is not an oppressed group. They have higher rates of being targeted for hate crimes. But and I think I've mentioned this last week and maybe in previous ones, but of the 20 most commonly cited sociological indicators for oppression, there's only one where the Jewish community is in the negative. And in the majority of the other ones, the Jewish community is in the positive, in doing better than most Canadians, including WASPs, right? Including the historic WASP elite. So I think that's really important. This notion of the Jewish community being a oppressed marginalized group that is being pointed out is simply not based in fact and should be consistently challenged, even if it leads to being attacked for doing so. The Meta, as people certainly saw, they are defining Zionist now in most uses as racist. And the Anthony Housefather is a co-chair of the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism, and they are claiming this as a success. That Deborah Wassman Schultz, the Democratic Congresswoman, I think from Florida or something like that, I believe is the other co-chair with Anthony Housefather. They're claiming this victory. Now, people talk about Anthony Housefather online. Anthony Housefather, of course, got that special position, special advisor of Trudeau for anti-Semitism a couple of weeks ago, and I've seen a few people online talk about Housefather as being like he's the person who's most lobbied by CIJA and like connecting that to his positions on different, on Israel and whatnot. And I think that's a real, I mean, I don't like it's like maybe a contributing factor, but I think it's a mistake. And to focus on that, and a lot more focus needs to go on something else that Anthony Housefather was part of, which is the high school he went to. Okay, so Anthony Housefather went to a private Jewish school in Montreal called Herzliya. So I punch in Herzliya into Google and Israel, and right away what comes up is this is their page about their Israel stuff. It says Herzliya is proud to unveil its groundbreaking Israel engagement initiative. This program, designed for all high school students, is integrated into our Judaic studies curriculum. The program focuses on 3 key areas: appreciating our homeland. Okay, appreciating our homeland is not meaning Montreal. That's not what they're referring to. Engaging with, or Canada, or Quebec, engaging with Israel, advocating for Israel. Okay, so that's this. And then it goes on and talks about how countering the BDS. And then it ends, it says, most important, students will develop skills and strategies to advocate for Israel at CEGEP, on university campuses, and beyond. Okay, so they're just absolutely explicit on their website, this school that Housefather went to, and you can find a whole list. They list a whole bunch of prominent people that have been to the school. That like advocating for Israel is like central to the curriculum. Now, I'm sure the curriculum has changed a bit since Housefather's times. Probably the BDS wasn't really on the agenda like that back then. But so maybe they've politicized it in a sense of like explicitly about countering Palestine solidarity, because the Palestine solidarity has got much stronger in the past 25 years, 30 years since he probably was in high school. But I guarantee you that the school had Zionism and Israel and probably sung the Israeli national anthem at times and the like. We have to go a little bit deeper than just like CIJA lobbying, right? We have to understand how deep the anti-Palestinian, Zionist, pro-Israel, whatever you want to call it exactly, indoctrination, educational infrastructure, the how much the majority of Jewish institutions in the country are deeply tied into creating advocates for apartheid, for genocide, for anything Israel does, right? That is like, there's many institutions in this country, and there are many prominent people in this country who've gone through that indoctrination process that, quite frankly, has to be upended. We have to subvert this. I don't exactly know how we do it all, but step one is to acknowledge it, reference it, talk about it. Most of these institutions are registered charities, so we are subsidizing most of these institutions. So that's one way, I think, of going at it. One way is just to put political pressure. In Quebec, all these high school, private schools are all funded by the provincial government, 50-60% of the provincial government. So they're getting a huge amount of public funding. Probably when you get through it all, it's probably 2/3 of the money for this school that's essentially public. it depending if you count all the different ways in which registered charities and and direct public funding go. But so this has to be referenced. It has to be challenged if we're actually serious about it. And I think we got to go way beyond just sort of siege lobbying kind of references. I've gone on longer than I expected. I'll get to a little bit about the encampments. Okay, so the McGill encampment was taken down. Quite a wild operation. I didn't. I found out about it. Apparently, it was sort of leaked. The students, some of the student protesters knew that this private security company was going to be brought in by McGill to disband it. They play this game. What to me seems, maybe it's legal, but it definitely it seems to go against the spirit of the court injunction, or refusal of the court to give an injunction for an emergency dismantling of the camp. So they basically hired this private security company to do the dirty work, but really the police did 90% of the work. The police secured the whole campus. They brought in SQ. They were like, I got on part of the campus and I tried to get closer, and there's like Sûreté de Québec, so outside of Montreal, police were brought in. Hundreds of cops were all around. The campus was shut down, not just for the day, but apparently the next day. And like the daycare on campus, like, dozens and dozens of different, library classes were not many classes, but some summer classes, offices, all the like. I'm sure thousands and thousands of people had their days disrupted, but apparently it was also the next day. So they went really all in on doing it. Then the Montreal police, unsurprisingly, the next night there was a protest, a kind of emergency protest against it. The police were really brutal against that. I didn't go to that on Thursday night, but there's some images online of the police attacking people after they'd already dispersed the demo, and quite violent kind of stuff. Which is the Montreal police. That's if you've been through the Quebec student strike in 2012 and 2015, and dozens of anti-corporate globalization demos and anti-capitalist demonstrations, they are very violent. It's kind of unique on the Palestine. Mostly they haven't been. They mostly have been quite civil on Palestine compared to how they treat the left, the radical left, more generally. But so there's some of those tactics were employed on Thursday night. A number of other camps were also UBC voluntarily. Now, University of Windsor made an agreement where they seem to have given the students a fair bit in terms of divestment and relations to Israeli universities. And how that all plays out. I don't know exactly what University of Windsor had in terms of investments and relations to Israeli universities, so that kind of matters in assessing it. But they seem to have come fairly much further than any other university in terms of acceding to the protesters' demands. The reaction from the main pro-Israel groups, the different Jewish organizations and the like, is stunning. The level of freakout is just completely wild. And considering, if you think about it, this is just like an accord between an independent university and students. They obviously have all rights to make this agreement, but the panic is out of control. So James Pasternak, Toronto City Councillor, I don't know what he has to do with University of Windsor, but he jumps in and is wild threats against University of Windsor. Says it could face charges if they proceed with agreeing to demands to divest from the state of Israel financially and academically. Just threatening charges. You have Housefather jumps in. I reviewed the agreement signed yesterday by University of Windsor, and I'm deeply disturbed. I'm working with Deborah Lyons, the special envoy. So now we have the special envoy on anti-Semitism, Jewish community relations, speaking with the special envoy on Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism, Deborah Lyons, to engage University of Windsor on this issue. I've reached out to Jill Dunlop, who's Ontario minister responsible, so they're getting the Ontario minister involved, and looking forward to her leadership of the file. The Windsor Jewish Federation panics. Then you have B'nai B'rith saying, CJ has obviously panics, crazy statement. Then you have B'nai B'rith saying, weak capitulation to the demands of a group's unlawful encampment on university property. B'nai B'rith put the university on notice. We informed the university that we will leave no stone unturned in ensuring that if there are any aspects of the agreement that violate the legal and human rights of our constituents, we will pursue justice to the fullest extent of the law. Then the former Friends of Simon Wiesenthal has a front page National Post piece titled "Windsor Caves to the Anti-Semites," and he quotes Robert Lantos, who's some movie director I came across him in York. He was part of the whole backlash against York Palestine stuff a few years ago. And he says in this comment, Robert Lantos sent me a cryptic email from his set in Europe saying, "Windsor has fallen. Hamas rules." So it's just like total panic. I don't know if University of Windsor, is ready for this and are gonna, how that's gonna play out. But it's just wild to see 10 months into this mass slaughter, and the Zionist groups are just completely emboldened to make the most wild threats, the bullying. Even if they were defending something just, honestly, if they were defending something just and they were making statements like this, it would be pretty wild. But they're they're defending a Holocaust in Gaza, and they're making statements like this. Now, I guess a couple things on a more kind of positive note. I had a good. I'm not going to play the clip, I don't think, because it's a bit long. With Justice Minister Virani, Arif Virani, I bumped into him at the Assembly of First Nations. Well, I obviously knew he was speaking there at the Assembly of First Nations convention at the Palais des Congrès here, and I waited till after he spoke, and then he did this added session, and I kind of waited outside, and as he left the session, I went up to him and asked him if he would bring charges or call for an investigation under Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military in Gaza. And it's like a minute and a half clip, and he just like goes totally silent. And I just follow him, walking with him quarter, and he goes down the wrong hallway. So it's like he makes it, because I think just because he's flustered by the whole thing, and so it just extends the whole thing. It's kind of funny. I also on the Friday, Pierre Poilievre, I found out when I registered for this, I got into the convention. I found out Poilievre was speaking on Friday, and luckily I got to do a little challenge of Poilievre, lots of security, of course, RCMP, but people can see that on Twitter. And then I'm not sure if it makes sense to share this. I'll try to share, I guess, and see if this works. Let's do this. Anyways, I don't think the share is working, so and I know it hasn't worked in the past, but maybe I'll just give it. So then I on Friday, I guess it was, maybe the Poilievre was on Thursday. On Friday, Heather Reisman was speaking at this startup fest, and Heather Reisman, of course, the CEO of Indigo, part of the power couple, billionaire, worth about $2 billion with Jerry Schwartz, one of the most important pro-Israel players in the country. Basically, the couple that helped set up CIJA, and of course they do the Hesek Foundation, which has given about $200 million to support non-Israelis joining the Israeli military, among other things that support the Israeli military. And I was able to get into this room, which I was quite, I guess, happy with myself for getting in the room. and to challenge. Once I got in the room, I should have done things a little bit different. I probably had more time than I thought I had. But I was just viciously taken down when I referred to Reisman's funding for non-Israelis to join the Israeli military, brutalizing Palestinians. The security guard just like ripped me down on the ground. He like put his legs around my neck. It was totally bizarre. It was not even like a sensible kind of like tactic to neutralize me or whatever. And then like literally grabbed me while I'm on the ground, like yanks me like a good 10 plus feet on the ground, and then forces me out of the room and uh, chucks me against a wall aggressively. There's like 6, 7 security. I don't know how many security, tons of security. I'm not putting up any fight. Chucks me against the wall, like puts my arms by my back really aggressively, and then like marches me out of the venue. And then I get my phone back out and I start videoing him once he's released my hands, and then he smacks my video. Really aggressive, the second most aggressive treatment I've ever had. I think they were probably embarrassed that I got in the room. They were probably knew that there was likely to be some sort of effort, and it may have even actually been like looking for me. I'm not, that wouldn't surprise me. I talked to the head of the whole startup thing, and he was clearly aware of me, and he was aware that there was likely to be some effort at disrupting Reisman. I was very happy with myself because while I'm being pinned on the ground, I was able to turn, because when I walk into the room, Reisman's back is towards me. And I was able to get my camera. She then responds to me from the stage. And I was able to get my camera when I'm being pinned to the ground, turned it, and it like basically knocked out of my hand. And I get it back on her so you can get to see her looking at me. Anyway, so I'm very happy about that little element in the whole thing. But it got reported on by the Canadian press, so it was picked up all over about, and it was actually not a bad little like 3 or 4 paragraphs about the Hessig Foundation, what they do, about the protests, about the people saying she was funding genocide back in November, and the attacks, the police stuff, a little bit about that happened in Toronto. So it was very successful. It got out, the whole online on social media. It got good traction, and got the whole. It's still that charity question, right? People don't talk about the charity question. All of this is being subsidized. It's not just some, rich Canadian giving their money. It's all of us subsidizing, probably about half of it, almost half of it, because it's top tax bracket with the most like creative tax games that they can do with these foundations and stuff that Schwartz and Reisman are doing when they give $200 million. Towards half of that is basically all taxpayers paying for that. So that was, I think, a good thing. A couple other positives on the Palestine note. It came out that Elbit is suing the federal government because Elbit was turfed. The Israeli arms company was turfed from some contract process with the Canadian military. So we don't know if it's because of the Palestine stuff, but it may well be. That's a good thing. There's a Wall Street Journal has a story. Israeli scientists, businesses face boycotts, and talking about how much it's getting more and more difficult for Israeli researchers and scientists in Europe and elsewhere because of increased boycotts. Protests here in Montreal, 3 demonstrations this weekend, a car demonstration, 1 on the Saturday. I didn't go to 1 on the Sunday. I went to about 500 on Sunday. So, here we are, 40, I think it is, weekends later, still mass demonstrations. I saw images from Toronto, big demonstrations in Toronto. It's definitely the biggest internationalist uprising in Canadian history. So there's some, despite the horrors, there is some upside there. Again, I've gone on too long. I'll leave it at that, and go ahead with questions, and I will make Laura a co-host. Go ahead, Nadia, as I search for Laura.
Hi, Eve, thank you. I'm wondering if you're going to sue the security that wrapped you up. You should sue them. But anyway, I was wondering also, what on earth is this about the stock market doing well and going up because of what happened to what's his name, Trump. I don't, I don't understand, how can the stock market, and there's an element there which the element in the United States which the journalists haven't picked up is the usual armament of civilians. Like I wrote in Le Devoir today that there's no country in the world that has more arms than citizens. There are more arms in the United States floating around than citizens. And then the United States has the highest number of deaths. And they didn't even mention all the assassination attempts on previous presidents. So they're not dwelling on the horror that is going on in the US with its culture of violence that the journalists didn't report on. So I want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's not just about guns. The US obviously has way too many guns. It's also just, as you point out, culture of violence. I think it's a incredibly scared society. Level of paranoia, it seems off the charts. It's kind of weird because when you travel in the US, people are often, in some ways, more friendly than in Canada, kind of more outgoing. But then it clearly is just huge amounts of fear and paranoia and stuff like that I think is an element of all this. There's obviously been a whole bunch of assassinations of US presidents. So this is not like partly it's tied, this is all tied to, US imperial violence and just how much that culture there is. But yeah, so
the stock market going up. How do you explain that?
I don't really know. I haven't actually seen that. I didn't see that. So the stock market went up, I guess, Monday morning because of the assassination attempt.
Yes, I mean I heard that on the CBC, but I don't understand how is this possible.
I mean, I assume that he's going to win.
Yeah.
So if the stock market wants Trump to win, then that would make sense. But if Laura, if you wanted to
No, I was just going to say that too, Eve. I think it's because they think, and if you saw the slavish, going for Trump today, I mean, people are just, they like he's God. And so I suspect is that they think now he's a shoo-in. He's already probably going to win, but now he's really okay. Sorry, Yuri, you're on mute, Yuri. Good.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I just sorry, Eve, I missed most of the show today because I'm traveling at the moment. But I just wanted to say about this assassination attempt on Donald Trump. I don't even know really what to say. I mean, if people are going to talk about gun control, we should give up on that because just you can explain to the UK public why they have 99 problems, but the European Union isn't one of them. Americans have for whatever reason, they are obsessed with the gun culture and so forth. So I don't think we should even be talking about the gun culture. And I don't think everybody, and I don't think it's good for independent journalists and the best of the left to be engaging in all sorts of conspiracy theory. Was this a false flag? Blah 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 and stuff like that. But I actually wanted to ask, so two quick questions. Number one, do you feel that the protests in Israel, people demanding that Netanyahu resign and just accept a hostage, deal to release all the hostages and all of the mass popular uprisings in Israel against the very unpopular far-right coalition government of Israel, do you see that as a good step forward, even if most Israelis are Zionists, are Jewish supremacists? And I want to ask a question about the Canadian Army. Are there Canadian veterans that are engaged in anti-war issues and anti-militarism, and or is that something very unique in the U.S. which hasn't kicked off yet in Canada?
Well, I think there. I mean, I think there are individuals. I've met a few people over the years. I can think of two. I can't think of their names right now. Who were both former military people who got kind of like quite into activism. Some of it being uh, kind of have an anti-military. It's kind of I found interacting is somewhat interesting. Their sort of their kind of criticism of the military. It's sort of uh yeah, it's not really sort of like this thing should be disbanded, but there is, it isn't organized like the States. In terms of
Oh, very a quick follow up. What about Scott Taylor though, who I wanted him to like come on your show, and it was the one time like you had, like you got this guest I requested, but I was busy.
yeah, he represent. I mean, I think he kind of represents that though. Like, esprit du corps is like read by military types, and it's not anti-military. It's in many ways it's fairly pro. It would sort of be like kind of pro rank and file with this tinge of like criticism of the generals kind of element. It also gets into, he of course is critical of the like sort of bigger geopolitical kind of dynamics and the violations of international law by Canadian military and stuff like that. But he kind of couches it in a pretty sort of like, doesn't directly come out and say we should lessen Canada's militarism or lessen its budget or this kind of stuff like that.
In other words, in other words, the military can be reformed just like the police can be reformed.
Yeah, that would be, yeah, some of that. And I think probably his personal views and what comes out politically are probably not exactly the same thing. I do want to say one thing on the Trump thing. To me, I agree. I mean, it's not like, to me, the Trump thing is it's actually kind of like how big a role luck plays in history. And like, I get ultimately that, Trump is a reflection of a certain uh, economic, political, cultural, whatever of the US, reflects this, crazy capitalist decay of empire, all this kind of stuff, right?
He's the uglier American, just like Stephen Harper was the uglier Canadian.
Yeah, so he comes, but I do really I believe that Trump is like an assassination of Trump has more logic to me than many other characters, because I don't think it's as clear cut like who just like fills his shoes, right? Whereas like if someone was to kill Joe Biden, it's just like there's tons of different sort of like liberal, imperialist, whatever that's just going to replace him, whatever. But Trump does have this somewhat unique relationship to whatever, right? Like to Americans or a segment of Americans or whatever, right? And but like he clearly was like, or my understanding is, and I haven't followed it that closely, is that he just turns his head and he would be dead otherwise, right? Like it was like just a total little blip of luck in whatever, why he turned his head at that moment, whatever. And so if he's killed, that would have, I think, fairly significant consequences. Maybe it would lead to spurring US fascism because sort of the Trumpian crowd would be appalled and would turn to violence, or I don't know what exactly would happen, but I think either way, either Trump doesn't win the election and then that means something, or conversely. But to me, so that's like so much of this incident will lead to all kinds of like, I don't know, speculation of sinister plots or this and that. Maybe true, maybe not, I don't really know. But to me, like, as important of a kind of like concept that comes out of this is just this sort of like randomness, quite frankly, of life, of there really are just like, can be kind of random things that happen that can have quite substantive effects on history. And I think in this case that may be maybe what, you know, one of the things that's we're left with in this. But anyways.
And Eve, one thing I've noticed on here is now you hear a total quieting down of calls to replace Biden, and I think that's going to be over now. I think that's gonna, maybe it'll come back later, but right now I think it's having that effect.
So
okay.
It's weirdly good for Trump and good for Biden.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Okay, Claire, go ahead.
In 1949, when Canada helped start NATO, they said that they should have peaceful resolution as the first priority of anything, and to prevent the use of force. Why doesn't Trudeau say this? We will spend all of our 2% on conflict resolution. We'll put all the Canadians to work to try and solve problems and peacefully, and get people to talk to each other.
Yeah, it wouldn't go over well with the arms makers. It wouldn't go over well with the military, and it wouldn't go over well with Washington.
You want to keep them happy?
That's why he doesn't do it. That's
he's hesitating on spending all of it, right? So why not at least spend 0.6% on
I think
what it was meant for?
I think Trudeau. I don't think that Trudeau is personally committed to this. In this case, I think Trudeau has clearly been, bullied into it, or whatever you want to call it. This was like a very aggressive campaign from, U.S. senators, from NATO, from U.S. ambassador, from all those forces within Canada, the think tanks, the establishment. I think Trudeau, I don't think they're going to hit the 2%. I think they understand that ultimately, when it comes electorally, that the public is not actually, there's other people have other priorities than putting more money into the military. And so that devotion of public resources towards this very arbitrary figure is not politically logical for Trudeau, but they felt the need to announce that they're going to do that, which in and of itself to me is a really bad thing, right? Even announcing, if they don't even reach it, I mean, it's all part of a process of increasing and honestly just legitimating this notion where we shouldn't be increasing. We should, of course, be cutting back substantially of military spending. That's what we should really be doing in the here and now. But where it's just a further down that process of going in the wrong direction. But so yeah, I don't think Trudeau has any principle, though, right? He doesn't this is just somebody who flows with the political kind of direction. But yeah.
Okay, Yuri, go ahead.
Oh, do you think there's any hope for the war, the genocide ending, given once again the mass popular uprisings against Netanyahu and his far-right coalition, even though a large majority of Israelis are unfortunately Zionists, Jewish supremacists? But do you think them demanding that the hostages be released, make a deal with Hamas, do you think there's going to be any hope that
I think that
Palestine justice will advance?
Yeah, sorry for not responding to that part. I read one of the two previously. I think that the protests in Israel are a good thing. I think we should be clear at how limited they are, and we shouldn't in any way frame it as like this is the peace camp and these are protests principally about hostages, about Netanyahu's corruption, about his the judicial policy and all this kind of stuff, other things that are about basically how Netanyahu threatens Jewish Israelis or liberal Jewish Israelis position or politics and stuff like that. But I think fissures within Zionism are a good thing, right? And And yeah, and like, yeah, I mean, like, if the hostages, if they can end the killing to get the people that Netanyahu has, or that Hamas or other groups have in Gaza, then that's I think a good thing. But it's very limited in terms of its how, they don't, for the most part, don't really care about Palestinians.
Yeah. Okay, so Eve, we have one last question from Iman. Go ahead, Iman.
Hi, Eve. Thank you so much for all that you do, and like literally putting your body on the line many, many times over. I just wanted to ask you a question. This is about Anthony Housefather, but just to give you a tiny bit of context, I'm a Palestinian parent living in Toronto. And I'm one of the co-founders of Toronto Palestinian Families. We've been in coalition with Toronto Jewish families to work on anti-Palestinian racism within the public school system, and specifically the TDSB. We had a small but fragile victory recently, you may have heard, around getting anti-Palestinian racism as part of the combating hate and racism strategy. I say fragile because we know that a lot is happening behind the scenes to dismantle what we've achieved. I mentioned Anthony Housefather because there seems to be a lack of anti-Zionist, non-Zionist voices that to influence our public school system. They, B'nai B'rith, CIJA, Friends of Simon Wiesenthal are the ones who get to say, what is taught around Holocaust education, around Jewish history, etc. And with Anthony Housefather there, the question is, is it possible, and what is the way that we have more progressive Jewish voices invited so that there is more diversity in thought? We know that removing these folks is impossible, but how do we add progressive voices to this equation?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, congratulations. I think that is a real victory, and congratulations for that good work. The backlash to it is like pretty astounding that there are people like protesting the inclusion of anti-Palestinian racism, and then that I'm sure you saw that Globe Mail op-ed that was just a total outrage scandal responding to it. But I don't know. I don't. Obviously, with the IJV and Jews Against Genocide and getting them more implicated. Personally, I think there needs to be a politic, and there's very few people willing to advocate this, but a politic of what Norman Finkelstein wrote about 20 some odd years ago in the Holocaust industry, of just putting up clear that like there is a use and quite obviously abuse of the history of the Nazis extermination of European Jewry to basically enable crimes today, right? And so I think we need to be, it's very marginalizing to say that, but I don't think there needs to be more like anti-Semitism education, just better anti-Semitism education in schools, right? I would just take the position that like there is a whole industry of this kind of focus that is completely out of proportion with Canadian history. As the Nazi Holocaust was horrible, but it wasn't here, right? It didn't happen in Canada. Canada's pretty, sort of fairly tangentially connected to the Nazi Holocaust. So like, why is that such an important part of like, educational process? There's so many other things that, right? And, Amira Haas, I've talked about this. Amira Haas in a Haaretz column 4 or 5 years ago pointed out that in Ottawa, they were setting up the Holocaust monument, and there wasn't, at that point at least, and I'm not sure if that's changed, there wasn't a monument to First Nations or the dispossession of Indigenous people, right? Here, right? So how to like, to advocate that politic, like the federal government is putting tens and tens of millions of dollars into these Holocaust museums. The most obvious one, the one in Montreal, big, huge addition to the Holocaust Museum, moving it from out in the west side of the city to right on Saint Laurent Street in this big, new building in a prime kind of location. The federal government put tens of millions, provincial, city government. But that the Holocaust Museum is like they're supporting the killing in Gaza, right? They've come out demanding the IHRA when the city government didn't adopt the IHRA. So like I get that it's a hyper marginalizing position to say like no to Holocaust education, but at an activist level, I mean, I understand that certain groups, and certainly if you're trying to get into a coalition with some Jewish groups, you might not be able to say that. But from an activist position, we should say that. We should say, like, no, public funding shouldn't be going to organizations that are supporting genocide in Gaza. And so yeah, I don't know to directly answer your question about the kind of coalition or maybe some of the backroom lobbying or coordinating that would need to be done to get some IJV people or Jews Against Genocide people, or maybe even just like the other group there, JSpace, yeah, get some of those people, more the liberal Zionist people on some of these committees, or like equal them out with the CJ, the B'nai B'rith people. I don't know, that kind of negotiating would need to be there. But I think bigger picture, we should push back against that. I don't know how to put it any other way, but the Holocaust industry, as Finkelstein detailed 20 some odd years ago, which has expanded drastically since that time.
I mean, we're just asking that it be given adequate representation as any other historical event, rather than it being completely taken over any and all education around Palestine, Israel. I think this is what we're asking for. I think it's important to talk about these historical moments, given that we're going through one right now. The last thing we want to do is shut down those conversations, but we just want to have a little bit of balance, at least to start, before we can, when we talk about truth and reconciliation in the school system, it's basically all lies. I don't know how we can talk about that and then say that, well, if you talk about anti-Palestinian racism, this is what they're claiming: Jewish children cannot wear the Star of David to school.
I just want to say, man, that Yuri Smoter, who has just spoke,
yes,
he did you see in the chat that he would love to interview on his YouTube channel? He has a program on YouTube. You can reach him at yurismuter@gmail.com if you'd be interested.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just share my email here as well in case I can't find. Let me try and find my.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, these are there's when there's the TDSB is putting forward some sort of strategy, obviously getting the inclusion of anti-Palestinian racism, or getting the inclusion of let's call it a more universalist interpretation of the Nazi Holocaust, or a less Zionist interpretation, or however you want to frame that.
Less Zionist.
All of those things are we should be doing, and I again, I congratulate you on the victory you had on that front. I'm just saying from a broader activist kind of look at this, I think the big picture level of the use of the horrors of the Nazis against European Jewry, and the whole, just all the sort of Holocaust or the anti-Semitism industry of just like we got this new position. University of Ottawa has now this new anti-Semitism position that's set up, which is clearly just a, how do I advocate for Israel's genocide of Gaza? We need to be pushing back across the board on that. Yeah, basically the use of the anti-Semitism stick against Palestinian justice.
Yeah, I think that's it, Eve. There are no more questions. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Eve.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yeah.